Kia ora and hello. I'm Chester for Earth Sciences New Zealand. It is time for your seasonal climate outlook. We recorded this second day of June. We're looking ahead to the winter of 2026, June, July, August. And let's just go ahead and get straight into the headlines. The main story will be the development of El Niño. Now, we are not in El Niño yet as of the recording of this video. So if you're watching this in early June, not yet El Niño, but we expect El Niño conditions to develop over the next 3 months during the winter here in New Zealand. June is going to be a transitional month. So essentially, we're going to go from that ENSO neutral, and we're going to transition to a more El Niño-like pattern. And lastly, on the headlines, the dryness. We expect dryness to become a bit of concern for us here in New Zealand, and parts of Aotearoa will be concerned about dryness through the upcoming spring and summer potentially. With that said, John Tunster is here. He's going to break it all down for us. John, thanks for joining us this afternoon.
No problem, Chester. Great to be here.
And I'm going to do my best to lead this conversation. I'm going to do my best Chris Brandolino impersonation. And I'm here with you, John, and we're going to talk about why El Niño is so important for us here in New Zealand and how it's going to reflect in the forecast that we've already put out. So, John, I'm going to put up the rainfall map first. Start there.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about what we're seeing here on the forecast. I'm going to take us off screen. Give me the breakdown.
Right. So here we are. Whole mix of colors.
Yes.
Pretty different to what we've seen in some previous seasonal climate outlooks. So it may look like a bit of a hodgepodge, but there is a story here, and it does make sense. Now, the one that stands out most is the west of the South Island, above or normal. That comes from what we're expecting to develop sort of from mid-late season, when we should see more west or southwesterlies, and those tend to produce more rainfall than normal for those parts of the country. Mm-hmm. Now, correspondingly, right next to that, in the east, you've got your straight up below normal. That's because those parts of the country in more westerly flows, we just see less rainfall sheltering from the Alps. So they've got a below normal. Now, elsewhere in the country, it sort of is a bit more of a mixed signal that we're trying to encompass, a sort of a transition away from areas that will be still affected by those west to southwesterly fronts occasionally. So that's kind of like the southwest of the North Island and occasionally the upper South Island. And that's why we've got those in the sort of normal to below normal category. Meanwhile, back into dry is the upper North Island and the east of the North Island. And those, in these sort of west to southwesterlies, especially with what we expect to see with nudges of high pressure pushing in every now and then, those don't tend to fare well in rainfall terms in this sort of setup.
So, John, I'm looking at this outlook that you just sort of broke down for us. And one of the things that comes to mind is that it actually looks eerily similar to the month we just completed. May had a lot of the same flavor, not as much in the west of the South Island, but I think overall it had a bit of a flavor. Is that reflective of the developing El Niño, do you think?
I think that what we had in May was one very particular type of setup. We had enormous slow-moving high-pressure systems sitting over us. We may not necessarily expect the dryness in this SCO to come from the same type of pattern.
Okay.
It may be more from there should be high pressure occasionally pushing in from the west, but it's kind of these southwesterlies that will just not produce good rain, generally speaking, for a whole heap of the country. Whereas in May, we just had massive high pressure systems sitting across the whole country and not going anywhere. So May was a pretty special case, I think.
Okay, that makes sense. And so with that said, you were talking about these southwesterlies or westerlies that are expected to develop, and we see that reflection as well in the temperature forecast for the next 3 months. Tell me what we're looking at here as I switch over to the temperature map.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it's really the South Island that's the easiest one to explain. We've got all the colors. We've got in the west of the South Island, we've got average or below.
Hmm.
That's because we think that as the season pushes on, we will see more west to southwesterlies. So a bit more subdued temperatures, especially with daytime highs, could be knocked back a bit with that kind of onshore, occasionally showery flow. But then meanwhile, directly adjacent to that, in the east of the South Island, we'll get the occasional foehn wind, I think, especially late in the season. I would say that August is when we may see those popping up a bit more. And you end up boosting temperatures quite well with those. It's still a mixed category. It's still above or average. It's not straight up above. So there's still a bit of a mixture in there. And the whole rest of the country is basically average. And that's kind of marking out the relatively weaker wind flow anomaly we're expecting in those areas. It's generally southwest, but with high pressure just out to the west. So there's sort of a relative lack of really warm flows, but not necessarily cold flows either. So it's a bit of it sort of evens out as kind of a mix of things, and so hence the average.
All right, so average, that doesn't necessarily mean there won't be cold periods, there won't be warm periods, but when you average everything out over the next 3 months, it's going to be kind of an average winter temperature-wise for the North Island and the top of the South. Is the way it seems to want to play out, right?
Yeah, I think so. Okay. And as you say, just having a whole seasonal, 90-day period that says average doesn't mean we won't have interesting couple of day periods bundled in there.
Yeah, I mean, there will be cold periods. We already saw that in May, actually. We had some cold temperatures. We had some warm temperatures. We had a little bit of a mix. And I want to switch back to the discussion about El Niño, because we're seeing that reflected in the precipitation forecasts and in the temperature forecasts. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on with the sea surface temperatures. I'm going to skip over to our sea surface temperatures map here. And so I've got that on your screen now. I'm going to do a little fancy drawing here. Wish me luck here. I'm not much of an artist, John. But essentially, the region that we are most concerned with is approximately here along the equator, what is called that Niño 3.4 region. We do look at the whole equator as a whole, especially this area where El Niño was first discovered, this area down here.
Yeah.
But essentially, that 3.4 region is the place that we are probably most concerned about. And I'm going to walk through the temperatures, John, and can you break down to me what has changed from the beginning of April, when this map is showing up here, to the end of May, the more recent temperatures anomalies that are showing up here on the map?
Yeah, I think we're going to see it pretty clearly as we go forwards in time, but you can still see a few cool colors showing up, which is the blues, and then warm colors are just really starting to dominate. And by the time we're up to the end of April, any cool colors that remained in that Niño 3.4 box have completely eroded away.
Right.
And so we're already in the midst of a pretty rapid flip. We were in La Niña, which is cooler than normal temperatures in this region, only, let's say, 2 or 3 months ago. And we're already on the cusp of heading to warmer than average temperatures, hitting that El Niño threshold. So it's a real fast turnaround in the oceans. And it just keeps on continuing as we go into May, and it just pushes through. Warmer colors are coming in they're pushing in from both underneath the surface, which we'll see later, and also pushing in from both sides. There's various mechanisms that spread this warm water into this box, both from the east and the west, and it effectively means that this El Niño is, unstoppable is a strong word, but I think extremely hard to stop would be pretty fair assessment of it.
Right. Yeah. If you actually read our seasonal climate outlook, we've got a greater than 90% chance that El Niño is going to develop in the next 3 months. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe it's 95%.
That sounds right. Yep.
Yeah, pretty high. And to be honest, our seasonal climate outlook runs from June to August. I think that the odds are on that it would be in the first half of that period that we could see El Niño conditions fully being met.
So our viewers out there, people who are watching this here on social media, YouTube, Facebook, wherever they're watching, they'll want to keep an eye on the latest information that comes out from the media. We'll, of course, have the latest once El Nino is officially declared. But one of the things that I want to point out is we use a lot of different data, and that includes seasonal models, and we also look at certain factors with temperatures, ocean temperatures, the anomaly. We watch for the atmosphere to what we say, couple, when it finally comes together and kind of starts producing the right pattern. Tell me a little bit about this El Nino forecast that we have here on your screen. This is one of the things that we're using to make these forecasts, the relative Niño index forecast here.
So this is basically where we're looking at that box that you so artfully drew on the previous map, the wonderful Niño 3.4 box, which really is in need of some kind of PR or rebranding campaign, I think. And what we're doing is we're looking at the temperature anomaly within that and forecasting that forwards in time. So this goes out to October, and we're looking at how the temperature anomaly will change within that box. And the key thing, whole lot of lines on here, but really we should be focusing on the big black line in the middle, which is the average of a ton of different models. And the key thing is that it's going steadily upwards. In other words, it reaches El Nino thresholds during this winter, and then it keeps on strengthening further as we push into spring. Yeah,
this could be a significant El Nino event. One of the things that you mentioned earlier that's driving this is that the movement of the water from one part of the ocean to the other, from the Western Pacific to the east, and we've seen that here when you look at the ocean at depth. Here's a map of this. It's something we've talked about in the past video. You and Chris talked a lot about this. Can you tell me what we're seeing now that we are at the start of June?
Yeah, well, there's so much interesting stuff going on here. I mean, the top chart is showing sea surface temperatures below the surface. I just said sea surface temperatures below the surface. That's
close enough.
Doesn't work, does it? It's water temperature below the surface. And you can see this big tongue of warm air that's sitting beneath there. And throughout the last, I would say, sort of 5 months, that's been steadily pushing eastwards into the Eastern Pacific and rising to the surface. And effectively, that's the thing that in several months' time, that warm water, we had an oceanographer at our seasonal climate outlook meeting last week, and we discussed this with him. And the consensus was that once you've got this set up, it's going to be, you just can't really stop that eventually getting to the surface. And that's what feeds into the things we actually see at the surface, which is the warm waters characteristic of El Nino.
Yeah, it's like when you have a car and you push it down a hill, you have no brakes, you have nothing stopping it, it just starts rolling and rolling faster. It just feeds back on itself. So this is like a feedback loop where that warm water basically is setting everything into motion, and there's almost nothing to stop it. I mean, until you get to the bottom of the hill, right?
Something like that, yeah. That's kind of how it's felt for a while now, as we've seen all these factors line up to at first put La Nina under siege and erode away La Nina, and then just inexorably push us towards El Nino.
So El Nino is all but certain. So what we've done here, and you all have talked about this in past videos, you and Chris as well. This is that same index that we showed you earlier. In fact, I'll flip back to it, that relative Niño index forecast. And this is that forecast, that black line for the current developing El Nino in comparison to some big El Niños in the past. And the last strong one was that 2015, 2016. That's the one in green. And then we've got some other past El Niños, 92, 93, 97, 98, and so on back to the 70s. Tell me what's going on here with this particular image.
Well, the long story short is that we can compare it to historic events in various different ways. And what we can do is monitor how it's tracking right now. That's one thing that we can see in various observations, and we can see that this is tracking similarly to things like the classic 1997 El Nino. But then this is looking forwards in time and how the forecast lines up with how actual historical events turned out. So you can basically see that the black line, which is our forecast, is on track with some of these historic events and is forecast to head towards basically matching up with them.
Right. And I guess one thing to point out with this is, this is a forecast, right? There's always a possibility that it could end up on the warmer side or cooler side of the actual forecast. But the idea is we're already within that range. And it looks like if you compare it to some of these historical events, I mean, it's almost just a matter of time. For example, that 92, 93 line is much farther to the right. It looks like it developed a little bit later, but it still got there in the end, correct?
Yeah. They all develop at their own rates, and they all have their own quirks. But it does mean that we're within the family of historic El Niños, I think.
100%. And El Niño will be an important driver. It's not the only driver of our weather. We saw that last year with La Niña and that sudden stratospheric warming event, and you can get quirky things in between these large seasonal drivers. So even though we have this forecast, we get an idea of what the forecast will be like based on El Niño. We do use other parts or other bits of information to help inform our seasonal climate outlooks.
Exactly, yeah. And I think you might be segueing towards an interesting chart coming right up.
Yeah, 100%. Yes. Let's talk about this one.
Yeah, so this is a great time to sort of discuss some of those nuances that. Now, what have we got here? It's a little bit subtle in ways, because whereas our chart at the beginning, or our beautiful imagery at the beginning, was trying to pick a most likely category of rainfall, this is just looking at the chances of it being above normal.
Sure. In fact, I might have that chart originally here. There it is. There's that chart, and then I'm going to go back and flip back to what you're about to explain here.
Yeah. So this one that we're looking at here is basically saying, speaking of a wet winter, how are those chances affected when it's an El Niño? And the sort of brownish colors are basically a reduced chance of it being wetter than normal. And so what you can see is it does line up reasonably well with our seasonal climate outlook. One thing that it does point out very clearly is that, you discussed in your headlines at the start that dryness is something that we think may become a concern as this winter pushes on, and especially as we go into spring. Now, what we have seen a lot of over the last 12 months is these kind of boom or bust rain events coming down from the north. They've been a pretty regular feature of our weatherscape for the last year or thereabouts. I'd say roughly since sort of Cyclone Tam, which was Easter or just before last year. And we've just had another one recently. We're recording this on 2nd of June. There's one ongoing, or yesterday. What we're trying to say is that everything is kind of pushing away from that kind of picture. So it's not as if it's an off switch that suddenly these things will suddenly become impossible and never happen. But we do think that as time wears on, they should become less of a prevalent factor of our weather patterns, starting this winter and pushing probably into spring and into summer. And instead, we will probably start to see areas that have become accustomed, if it is possible to become accustomed to seeing periodic heavy rain events, instead trending to more of a drier lean. And this picture on the right pretty much supports that. Now, we would never write a seasonal climate outlook based solely off this. We take in all sorts of other things to account, but El Niño is one of our biggest drivers, and it does contribute quite strongly. Hence why there is a decent agreement between this and the seasonal climate outlook.
Yeah, and I think it's good to remind people, as you said, every El Niño has its differences. But when you look at El Niños in the past as a whole, this is a pattern that we're showing here, that winter months during El Niños tend to be drier or more likely to be drier in these areas that you've highlight here in the oranges. And so I'd be remiss to not mention that this is the time of year when we get a lot of our water recharge, which is outlined in our our seasonal climate outlook. And it's also a time when, the ag sector and other water-sensitive industries need to start thinking about and start planning about how they're going to be impacted by this once we get into the spring and summer months, correct?
Exactly. Yeah. It's a gradually developing picture,
Right.
and it may take some time to set in, but I feel like this is the direction of travel.
All right, John Tunster, we are fresh out of time, but as always, I really appreciate what you've broken down for us here today. Just excellent work. Thank you so much, John.
Thanks heaps, Chester, and see you in July.
Yes, for sure. We'll see you at the next month's video. And with that said, I'm Chester for Earth Sciences New Zealand, John Tunster for both Earth Sciences New Zealand and the Met Service. Thanks for joining us.